try this and I need help. I'll swing it. All right, this is the fourth budget presentation for 2014-15. Items to discuss, well, there's updates from New York State. The governor's budget proposal presentation was yesterday. The revenue projections that I'm going to present today will be the first as a result of the governor's. Remember, there will be a follow-up with the legislators afterwards. And then Krista Butter, our Director of Athletics, will discuss the athletic budget. Okay, before we get to the numbers, I want to show you the recent history of state aid, because I found at the last budget presentation, I used the word increase, and I want to be real careful when I use the word increase, because increase is a relative term. So let me just take you back to the recent history, and like any picture, this picture says 1,000 words all by itself. You'll notice across the bottom is the last 5, 6 fiscal years, including the one coming up, the one we're budgeting for now. You can see in 2008-9 what the state aid was, the big drop in 9-10, slight increase in 10-11, another substantial drop going into 11-12. That certainly was the worst. We've seen increases, I want to be careful to put that in quotes, going into 13-14, and potentially an increase into 14-15. But even if there was an increase of 5%, which is what we had heard leading up to the governor's budget, you can see at 14-15, we are still substantially lower than where we were 5 years ago. And this is important to start the budget discussion with, is when I say increase, it's really just comparing one immediate year to the next. If I go back over the last few years, it's not an increase at all. It's lesser of a decrease. It's not an increase. Let me show it to you another way. What's the GEA? We heard this term a lot, gap elimination adjustment. So I've taken that state aid graph again, and then I've introduced the gap elimination, and again, that's a decrease. So that decrease was what it was in 9-10. It increased and was its highest decrease in 11-12. So that decrease is getting less. It's not zero, it's getting less. So if I put it all together and say this is the impact on our aid, being the top graph, here is the gap elimination across the bottom, and we look at gap elimination from a cumulative basis, you can see not only did we lose every year, if you compare it now 5 years in, we're almost $6 million less than we would have been if the state aid formula ran its normal course, which is a substantial amount for this district.
So the state aid formula on this slide is the goldish one. That's the normal state aid formula where it should have been on.
No, this is the state aid formula of what we actually received.
The gold one.
The gold one. It would have been $6 million higher than that as of today. So it's substantial. So, having put that together, let me summarize, because this is important before we get into some of the numbers. The New York State expected, and I did prepare this before the governor presented, even if it were 5%, which was what the discussion was, it still would be less than where we first started this ride in 2008-9, which means the district has operated each year with anywhere from 800,000 less per year, as high as 1.4 million less in a particular year. The board, the administration responded. We did cut staff, we cut program to be able to stay within. But we are operating today almost 6 million, over 5 million less than we would have been if that state aid formula continued. So again, that's important to start with. The governor did have his speech, and he compared 13-14 projected, now 13-14 hasn't been completed yet, what the projected totals would be. And this information isn't what I created. This isn't even the order that I created. This is exactly off the state aid runs that the governor presented. So anyone can go to the state aid website and see exactly these numbers. I think that's important to point out. So for 13-14, the bottom number here is $12,994,397. That's what they are projecting that we're going to receive this year. His budget, right next to it, again, there's a lot of pieces there, is projected to be $13,669,929. To the right of that is the increase, I'm going to do it in quotes again, of over 675,000. Certainly not shabby if we were looking at it as it stood on its own. But let's go through each of these categories. Foundation aid, which is the aid the district gets based on its makeup, our enrollment, our free and reduced, our location, our assessments. That's the, every district gets it to some extent. Obviously the amount changes based on the district, but every district gets it. That has not changed. That is what would have changed if the formula continued to run. So we're in essence flat on that category. UPK, that's our Universal Pre-K program, flat again. These next items, OCs, high cost, private, hardware, software, transportation, I have asterisks next to those. Those are what we call expense-driven aid. We spend the money, we get some of that money back through state aid. But if you don't spend it, you don't get it. This is an important distinction because the only way we would continue to get that aid is if we continue to spend more. So it's not an increase. It's only reimbursing us, if you like, based on what we've already spent, and we would have to continue to spend it to get it. So that's not an increase. So what would be an increase? Well, this gap restoration number of $121,422, that is the only new money, if you want to consider it that way, that the district will be receiving. That is a far cry from the 675 that they're projecting that we're going to have. However, there's a piece in there that's not being reflected in the governor's budget. It is, however, in the law, and that is our debt is under a certain interest rate. Over time, interest rates have gone down. We've taken advantage of that whenever we could, but you can't always refund your debt. The state, however, says, well, wait a minute, you could have refunded. The interest rates are lower. What would you be paying? Or what would be the assumed interest rate, assuming you refunded? So they looked at all our debt, all the district's debts, and said, we think the rate should be this, and it's calculated. So there are some of our debt that we're paying at a lower interest rate, some not. But they recalculated all our interest rates. So they've determined, going back 10 years, that we are actually going to have our aid reduced because we're aided at a lower assumed interest rate. So that is a deduction of $45,000. So when I net the new money, which in this case is the gap restoration, with that building aid deduction, the real increase is a little under $76,000.
What's that as a percent on that?
Well, if you look at it as a foundation aid, it's 1%. If you look at it overall, it's significantly less. So it's not the 3.1%.
That third of 1%.
So it's an increase compared to last year, so it is a plus. However, I'm real careful when I budget, and I've been doing this now for 4 years for this district, and I'd be real careful using these numbers. I won't even use 13,669. I won't even use that number. And let me tell you why. Let me compare same time last year. So here we're looking at 13-14 in the first column, That's the legislative budget. And if you look at the last number, 13,327,570. That's what the legislator group said that we would be receiving. Well, on the previous slide, the governor said, no, you're getting 12,994,397. So our projected numbers have already been adjusted down 333,000. So even with the governor's budget, chances are the legislature will follow up to the governor's budget and be a little bit more. But once again, we're going to be real careful when we put our revenue budget together, because even what we start out with as a projection isn't going to be the exact numbers. And there's reasons for that. It's based, again, on enrollment, usage, actual expenditures. There's reasons for it. But in order to be prudent, we won't use those numbers. We'll use something a little bit less. State aid isn't the only revenue item. Tax levy is the other. Tax levy is determined by taking final expenditures, less revenue that we can expect, and that would be our levy. I don't expect you to be able to read and understand all these items. Really, the purpose of this for you and for the community is to see how many pieces go into this calculation, and how many pieces, or many of these pieces, we have no control over. And I'll take the first two at the top. The first two is the tax-based growth factor. We get that from the Office of ORPS, the Office of Real Property Services through the state. They determine what kind of increases we're seeing in the assessments. We can't control that number. The allowable tax levy growth factor, 1.46%. Remember, we can only increase 2% or CPI, whichever is less. 1.46% is CPI. It's less than 2%. That's what we're going to be using in the calculation. Those two numbers have the biggest impact on the tax cap. But these are projections. Just as the state starts out with projections, the same is true with our tax cap. This is a projection. If these numbers flow through up until April, when we make our final decisions, or you will, excuse me, I don't think I can make this any bigger. The tax levy threshold could be $7,567,000. I can make it bigger. Glasses, I have to see. Tax levy threshold could be $7,557,077. This is an increase of almost $260,000, which represents a 3.55% tax levy increase. The board could decide, assuming again this is our final tax cap, they could decide to go out at this amount, less or more. If they decide at 3.55 or less, we need 50% of the community to approve. If we decide to go out higher, then it requires 60% of the community to approve. So having given all that information leading up to this point, here is the projected revenue budget. Get it all on the screen. For 2014-15, the projected revenue budget is $22,263,793. That's an increase of 1.5% over last year. This includes a tax levy increase of a projected 2%. Again, it could be more, it could be less. It includes the state aid, use the word increase from last year, but again, those expenditure-driven aids are in that number of 4%. It also includes reductions in the appropriated fund balance and the fund balance applied or our reserves. That's necessary for long-term sustainability. To keep our savings intact is what gives us that long-term sustainability. And it has been a large part of our budget. It's now at a point where we need to reduce it. So what's the advantage of doing that? Well, in the news, the Office of State Comptroller We talked about this, if not last board meeting before, was going to do stress tests of school districts. And they have 5 different criteria to do that. 87 schools are in some state of stress out of almost 700. South Seneca is not one of them. We have no designation of stress at all, which is a good sign. But part of the reason we're there is because of our fund balance. Fund balance in relation to our expenditures and in relation to our revenue. If we start to draw down fund balance, then we would get on that list. So in order to maintain our lack of stress, if you will, not that we don't feel stress, but our lack of stress, we need to keep those savings accounts intact. Therefore, as we go through each budget year, I will be reducing our use of fund balance in our revenue.
And I appreciate that outlook and that direction, because it's important to think about not only to get from one year to the next, but to look at 3 to 5 years down the road. So, just a quick question. So the tax levy amount there is a 2% tax
Is that 2%?
levy?
Yes. Any other questions?
In order to achieve 1.51%, we're going down our fund balance by $200,000, right? The committee needs to know that. Leaves $900,000.
Correct.
Would it be in your projection in the future to have us carry our budget process out to like 2018 to see where it's going to end up?
Absolutely.
We've done it in the past.
We have done it in the past, and I do it unofficially, if you will, as I project out. In this case, we're showing leading after the governor's proposal, and I will start reintroducing at each presentation what the kind of impact that will have.
And though I want to be careful with that kind of projection too, because again, they're only projections. Because as you know, from year to year, things change. So I think you do a great job on projecting that far out, but I wouldn't call it the Bible of our budget for the next 5 years. Another question is, so you're saying that this 1.51% increase is the increase from year to year?
Correct.
At a 2% tax levy increase. And so we could go to a 3.55 tax levy increase. Not saying we are, but
Right. If that tax cap is where we end up.
I just want to make sure I understand.
Now, this is revenue. We talked about expenditures. Our expenditures are at $22.6 million. So the goal now for the rest of the budget process is to bring $22.6 million to our revenue. Because in order to be sustainable, we need to be able to live within our means and our expenditures match our revenue.
So there's 400,000 difference.
It's 400,000. And as we go through departments, buildings, transportation, salaries, health insurance, we'll be looking for ways to bring those all within that.
Okay, I have a question. The allowable increase in percentages of 3.55, is that a final number, or is
No.
that is not a final number?
That is not.
When do we anticipate the final number?
They are still tweaking what numbers can be included in there. For example, Steve and I just were at a meeting discussing the capital outlay project and what kind of impact that would have, because that wasn't discussed when the tax cap was first created. So there would probably be some more adjustments, but I would say probably, this is the end of January, I would say within a month, because I have to present this or file it with the state comptroller's office by March 1st. So all those questions should be answered by then.
Naomi, one of the things, is it possible on slide 10 where it's 14-15 revenue budget to show the expenditure and the difference each time so that we have that number there? It's visible, the fact that we have that number. Any other questions?
to our Director of Athletics. Mr. Butler.